Thank you, Natalie. So in a multitude of people is the glory of a king. Without a people, a prince is ruined. This sounds very familiar to the one we had talked about last week, that where the manger is clean, there's a lack of oxen, but the strength of the people is in the herd. Paraphrasing strongly. But the same thing happens here. There have been a lot of kings who have done a lot of harm to their own people. I don't fully understand how that works. You come to power and then you kill a full third of your nation. Seems like foolish to me. Solomon says it's foolishness. That in a multitude of people is the glory of the king. If you can get people to work together and be harmonized in an area, if you can work to get them to work together for good, that speaks volumes to you being a good king. But if it's going to require the half of your people to be murdered, probably not a great king.
Maybe Rehoboam should have listened to that instead of saying, I'm going to be worse than my father. And, yeah.
That's a good point. Oh. Well, somebody's been married for a while. And without people, a prince is ruined. Same concept. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is hasty to temper exalts folly. And part of this is just a sheer basic knowledge that if you're quickly angered, do you always understand the circumstance or the situation? I was talking to someone yesterday, actually, got to sit down and have lunch with somebody, and he's a foreman at his work, or manager. I'm not sure exactly what the exact title is. He's over most of the people on the floor. And his boss pulled him aside and said, hey, you have probably one of the dumbest employees you've ever had over there, because this is inspection time and he's asleep at his post. And the man I got to talk to yesterday says, yeah, you're right. He may be the dumbest person we have ever hired. Or he has a wife who has terminal cancer, and he has a newborn, and he has a 3-year-old. And he's been working 12 hours a day at home and then working 12-hour shifts because you won't hire another person, and he's been doing this for 11 months straight, and he's worn out, and he can't stay awake. Or he's the dumbest person you've ever hired. Choice is up to you. And the person who's quick to anger may never, ever understand the situation that's happening and come to be able to make a rational decision on what to do. And so I think that's part of what he gets at here in verse 29. If you're slow to anger, you're going to have great understanding. The way that James phrases it over in James chapter 1, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. That there's a process that we should go through where we find out the situation, we don't speak against it immediately, process it through, and then there are some times where anger is going to be required. Jesus, whenever he sees the money changers in the temple in John chapter 3, sees what's happening, he goes and he sits down, he makes a cord of whips. Anger is still going to be the end consequence for him, but he's gone through appropriate steps first. I think the same thing happens here in verse 29. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, and he who has a hasty temper excels or exalts folly. Verse 30, if someone would.
Sound hard is life to the body, but envy is rottenness to the bone.
So some translations may render that a healing heart gives life to the flesh, or other translations have it as a tranquil heart. And he directs that directly. He contrasts that in verse 30 with envy makes the bones rot. So I think contentment would be soundness or contentment or a tranquility or healing. All of those seem to kind of be on the same length of what Solomon is trying to get to. Have you ever seen someone who is eaten up with envy? Whether they have more opportunities than I do, or they've been dealt a better hand in life than me. And they have all their joy robbed from them, from what someone else has that they think they deserve or they should have equal amounts or more amounts, rather than recognizing that we still have enough to be content with. And so he'll make the point later on over in chapter 15, or I think it's chapter 15 or 19. I was flipping through quite a bit today, and I'm getting lost in which chapter it is, where he mentions that it's better is a little bit with quietness and contentment, than a whole lot with envy and strife. I'll also mention, better is eating a plate of herbs with peace in the house than it is eating a fattened calf with war. Pretty good ways of phrasing that. And so he makes the point here that the tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. A little bit is far better with contentment than it is a lot. And so whenever we see some of that coming up in our lives, someone else deserves, has what I deserve, or someone else has a better shake than I have, they've gotten a better hand up than I have, yada, yada, yada. Really ask ourselves, are we doing more harm to ourselves than good in this process? Verse 31 is going to be very, very close to what we had looked at last week, where he mentions that in verse 21, whoever despises his neighbor is a sinner, but blessed is he who is generous to the poor. He'll phrase that slightly different in verse 31, that whoever opposes a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. And a lot of what Solomon gets at is not just repeating Old Testament law, but explaining why that's the case. And so there's some laws when it comes to giving a pledge. So I'm going to go to Lee and I say, Lee, I need $15 for today. I need to pay off X, Y, or Z, but I don't have anything to give you as to hold that money. So I'm going to give you the only thing I have, and that's my cloak on my back. Well, the Old Testament law says if that's the case, then Lee, even if I don't pay him by the end of the day, Lee's got to give me my cloak back, because that's all I have in the world, and that's going to keep me warm tonight. And yet, we find over during the minor prophets especially, where they were selling poor people for a pair of sandals. So they were not only taking their cloaks and pledge, but then when they couldn't pay, they were selling that pledge to somebody else for a pair of sandals. And so Solomon explains why is it that God cares about this. He says, whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker. And this isn't just, Lee's doing me wrong because he's not giving my cloak back and he sold me for a pair of sandals. It is, he's insulting the maker. And that should be something that we consider whenever we go out and we treat other people who are poorly. I heard someone mention that they were out with their wife and they were in a big city and they saw a man digging around in the garbage can, looking for any scrap of food that he could find. And I'm sure if you've been to downtown Richmond, if you've been up to Washington, D.C., that isn't a too uncommon sight. And he kind of just made a simple remark down the line of, well, that's a sad situation. That's unfortunate. And his wife said, every time I see a homeless person like that digging for food, I think that at one point in time there was a mom who cradled that child and sang to him about all the joys and hopes that she had for him in the world, only for those things to be dashed. And it just kind of took him back, saying, well, that's true. Somebody had great plans for this person. And the same thing can be said about us spiritually, that our Heavenly Father has sang joys over us and plans for us spiritually, only to see us become destitute and ravaged with sin. And it's an insult to our Maker to let our lives get to that extent. And that also applies here just physically, whenever we see people who are ravaged by sin and there's some consequences of that in their lives, that if we mistreat them, we are still insulting the Maker. Mm-hmm.
Envy is rottenness. I was thinking about this earlier today, actually, this thought. Like if Lee buys a Ferrari, I'm not going to be jealous of that because I never planned to own a Ferrari, something of that magnitude. But that becomes a difficult thing when you look at your place of employment or something where you're doing the same, someone else is doing the same, and they seem to be better than you. And I was thinking about Matthew
And sometimes those things happen unjustly as well. You know, I know that Lee and I have talked about this not too long ago, that some people get passed over for things that they are well deserving of in favor of other people who maybe are not as deserving of. You know, I know of individuals who have, applied for, schools or applied for jobs, and they were every bit as qualified, or if not more qualified than other people, and then passed up, and had to make whole career changes just to, kind of fend for their family, so to speak. And that could leave you saying, well, that's unjust, and then that envy remains as bitterness to your bones. Or there's tranquility about life, or a healing heart that allows you to just move on with life and see the joys that you do have.
I looked at sometimes those Passovers or those, what I consider unjust missed opportunities. Maybe sometimes those things will fall, and those things will work out for the better. For me not to have gotten what I wanted. It's difficult when you're in the moment, but it makes worse with the
It is. It definitely is. What does he say about verse 31, about the one who's generous to the poor? They honor God. I mentioned the verse last week, and I couldn't find it, and Brittany helped me find it today. Chapter 19, verse 17. Thank you. For whatever reason, some proverbs, I think, tend to resonate with you individually a bit more, and you memorize those ones a bit easier. This is the one that I memorized easier, that whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deeds. So very, very similar concepts, that if you honor the poor, you honor God. If you're generous to the poor, you honor God. That if you lend to the poor, or if you're generous to the poor, you lend to the Lord. Those concepts kind of go hand in hand. So he mentions that here in verse 31. If somebody would, let's read verse 32.
The wicked is banished in his wickedness, but the righteous has a refuge in his death.
And here we're getting much more into the spiritual consequences of it. We see this. We see something if you talk to people who are facing death of a loved one who is a faithful Christian, and you see how people talk to them, and you see how they respond to death, and it's very different. It's different than you losing someone that you have very little hope for. And I know that Brittany and I have talked about that quite a bit, in our own personal lives, that there are some deaths that are deaths, and we look forward to seeing them again. We look forward to being with them again. And while they hurt, it is not the same as the one who you have very little to no hope for. And we don't always think of it in these exact terms, but he mentions very clearly in verse 32 that the righteous find a refuge in death. That death, as Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes, as looking from a worldly standpoint, is a great evil. It's a great evil that happens to everybody. But Solomon also, when he's looking through spiritual lenses, sees it as a refuge to the righteous. And that's a hard concept for us to really adopt as our own. But all of us are going to have our appointment. It's just a matter of whether that's going to be a destruction for us, or an overthrowing here in verse 32, or a refuge for us. Lee?
Anna Cook is a good friend of mine, and at a young age she died. She had the first heart lung, one of the first heart lung transplants in the country, and then years later, the body was rejecting it, and she went in for another one, and she died. But that funeral was the best funeral I've ever been to in my entire life. It was uplifting and praise and worship to God, and having so many people that love God, praising God,
saw some, it's funny how things are phrased sometimes that just, highlight something that you haven't really thought of before. But someone had said recently that if you're a godly person, this earth is the closest that you're ever going to get to hell. And if you're a worldly person, this is the closest you're ever going to get to heaven. And that seems to be a very fitting statement.
I don't recall yours spoke about the death of a child, and the benefit was the lack of suffering.
Ecclesiastes, I haven't memorized in this one. It's on the left-hand page. It's chapter 6. It's just one of those really hard verses. The stillborn child is better off than he. He says, if a man fathers 100 children, in verse 3, and lives many years, so that his days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and has no burial. I say the stillborn child is better off than he, for it comes in vanity, goes in darkness, and his name is covered. More than that, he has not seen the sun or known anything, and yet he finds rest rather than he. And yet, even though he should live 1,000 years twice over and yet enjoy no good, do not all go to one place. Is that the verse you were thinking of?
I was thinking it was something, but I couldn't remember what he said.
I think that's one of the verse 32 is one of those perspective verses that sometimes is hard for us to have that perspective. That for a righteous person, it really is a refuge. And sometimes it's a little different for people who have maybe like a terminal illness or a long time disease that they've been suffering with, and you see that release, from this, as opposed to maybe someone who was younger, and we think, well, they were still in the prime of their life. They were taken away before they got to really live, and yet both the passages in Isaiah 57 are very fitting, that still there's some release for them. There's some refuge for them. Josiah might be the wrong king. Is he one of the very last ones in Israel who was righteous, or Judah? Josiah, he had tried to do a reform, and yet the people were too far gone for them to really reform. And God promises them that he would take him young before, and so that his children would have to suffer the consequences of those actions, but he wouldn't see the destruction of the kingdom. That the reward from God for him being such a good king is to actually be taken young and have this refuge in death. Wait.
And not that I claim to ever know, I don't think in some ways it might be wrong for us to even try to say we know, but almost that applies to everything in life, right? You talked earlier about, not receiving something, or somebody gets a position and we didn't get it. Might have been the best thing that ever happened to us, and maybe later God will show us the path of your life, and that, look, had you gone this way, you would have been down there in Sodom and Gomorrah like Lot was, and I didn't give you that job that you rightfully deserved, so that you ended up going this way. And look at, maybe one day we'll get to see all those twists and turns in our life, and how God, if we're faithful to him, has not only in death, but also in life, all of the things that sometimes, and for an angry person, are prone to get angry, because we missed that job. We might even do things that are wrong to try to twist or to force it that direction. But maybe we find ourselves, when we calm down, to be fighting against God himself.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I know when those twists and turns in our life are, but
Yeah.
I do know if we put God first, it'll direct our paths.
And you had mentioned just getting out of MP school, right? And you got held back not held back, but you got pulled aside, shunted aside for another position. You and your other guy you were with, and you were angry at that. I didn't get to do what I wanted to do, only to that really be a benefit in the long run. And it's one of those things that's hard to see at the time, if not impossible to see what's going to happen at the time. And yet, looking back, sometimes you get to see that exact thing. Someday I'm going to do a little more research, but there's a really good story of the Indian weavers, of how they weave their saris. That you have one person behind who has the pattern in their mind, and you're the one person running the shuttle. And the person running the shuttle has no idea what the pattern is going to be. He's just told when to run the shuttle, and whenever the sari is done, that's when he gets to see what his work has produced. So we'll talk about that in another time. Let's go ahead and pick out the last couple of verses for tonight. If someone would, let's read verses 33 through the end.
Wisdom rests in the heart of him who has understanding, but what is in the heart of fools is made known. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. The king's favor is toward a wise servant, but his wrath is against him who causes shame.
Solomon makes this point a couple times throughout the book in very similar fashions in verse 33, that wisdom rests quietly in the heart of a man of understanding, and that even in the midst of fools, though, that wisdom can be known. And you will see that oftentimes, not to be too crass about it, but if you go to a business meeting, you're going to have a group of men who some are older and wiser, some who are older spiritually and wiser, and some who are younger spiritually and not as wise. And even for the ones who are wise and stay quiet, their wisdom usually gets seen in that situation. And that's just one that maybe some of us men get to see and understand. That you see the wise person in the business meeting who's staying quiet, and yet when he does make his comments, people recognize the wisdom that's there and tend to follow after that to some degree. It doesn't always happen that way, unfortunately, but that is the hope. And sometimes you will see that. And that's the point that he makes in verse 32, that the wisdom is going to rest, verse 33, the wisdom rests quietly in the heart of a man with understanding, and it makes itself known even in the midst of fools. The righteousness exalts a nation. This is a really, really good one anytime you think about what's going on in our society. That righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And unfortunately, we have exalted sin and called that a torch to the world around us. What year was Roe versus Wade? Is it 76, 78, somewhere right around there? Somewhere in the mid 70s. And we were one of the first countries to push that through. And most Western cultures have fallen to that same pattern that we've laid out. And we view that as progress and a good thing, and yet Solomon clearly states it's a reproach to any people. How true that is.
My footnote for reproach says shame or disgrace. Definitely that is one of the largest shames and disgraces that our nation has.
And it goes, continues not just with that one area, but you think about some of the other changes that happened in the last 10 years. And we view that as progress. We view that as being progressive and forward-thinking and moving into our modern world rather than what it is. It's shameful.
Solomon didn't listen to his own advice, I don't think.
Very true. Very true. Getting off on a slightly different tangent just because it's been on my mind. We would talk about being saved by faith on Sunday, and kind of consequently once saved, always saved kind of tends to go hand in hand with those doctrines. And when we talk to people about that, what happens to someone who is diligently seeking after God and then sin deceives them and their heart is changed? And then their answer is always, well, I don't know if their heart was ever really towards God in the first place. I don't know if they were really a redeemed person. And yet Solomon is such an excellent example where he is handpicked. Out of all of David's children, he's the one that God says is going to be him as king. And then out of everything he could have asked, he asked for wisdom, and God says, I'm going to give it to you. Your heart's after me. I'm going to give you wisdom more than anyone before you, and I'm also going to bless you with all of these other things. And then it wasn't that Solomon never cared about God. It wasn't that he never believed, that he wasn't a follower of God. But most clearly that sin deceived him and took him further than he ever intended to go. So, that's just my little soapbox. So, verse 35, a servant who deals wisely has the king's favor, but his wrath falls on the one who acts shamefully. And again, some of these are more truisms than absolute certainties. We'll get into one a little bit later on in the book where he says, basically answer a fool according to his folly, and the very next verse says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. These aren't always absolutes, and this is one of them, that generally speaking, that if you act wisely, the king's favor is for you. And you think of Solomon's forefather, Joseph, where that's the case, and all the things that he acted, it was wisely. And for the most part, he received favor for the things that he did. End up in jail, but even in jail, he received favor by acting wisely. And so that still comes true.
I was thinking of Naaman as well.
Mhm.
Sorry, Nehemiah.
Okay. I was thinking Naaman,
With King Artaxerxes, he had
Oh.
favor enough that the king even recognized when he wasn't doing well, asked why.
yeah.
Because he was a wise man, had found favor because of his wisdom, really,
Mhm.
and godliness, found favor with the king.
Daniel rises to his position of power, so does Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this obviously, while applies directly to servants and to kings, the same thing happens for us. If you want to, as an employee, how do you gain favor with your employer? Act wisely. And the answer isn't to be, oily or smarmy. It isn't the idea of make a presentable look. I'm sure you've seen those people that that 10:15 the boss is going to do his rounds, and suddenly at 10 o'clock that person gets really busy and they're making phone calls and they're making deals, and as soon as the boss makes his round at 10:15, it's back to slow as Moses pace. You may have seen those people who or the ones who come up and they talk they talk up the boss a lot, and they work him over and buddy with him rather than just acting wisely and doing your job right. And sometimes for a little while they get ahead, but a lot of those people stall out pretty quickly, mid-management or even lower, rather than just doing your job right and truly finding favor with them.
Always walked around, he walked fast, he always had a stack of papers, and he was obviously on his way to something. After a period of time, people began to realize he was always carrying the same stack of papers, he wasn't actually going anywhere, but it looked really good for a time, like he had a destination he was headed to, and he had his papers with him, so he always carried the same papers.
I saw a news article. It was a steel mill. There was 2 steel mills that were operated side by side, or were steel mill, tin mill, something like that. And they had conglomerized both of them. Right in the middle is a supply office. That the paperwork was a black hole. Nobody owned the supply office. No one took care of it. And the one guy who operated that building kind of got a letter saying you aren't working anymore, but kept on getting a paycheck. And for like 15 years, he realized if I just show up and talk to everyone as they walk by, they're going to assume that I'm still working there, and this paycheck's going to keep coming. And for like 15 years, he did that. But someone, they did a big audit in the company and realized, that shack over there has an employee in it that isn't an employee that we're paying. And they sued him for all of his back pay. So the wrath falls on he who acts shamefully. And while individuals may seem like they get ahead by acting that way, very rarely do they really truly get ahead in the long run with that. Any thoughts or comments at the end of chapter 14?
I was just gonna say, I love the different level, whenever you think about each little proverb individually, there's so many ways you can apply it, but also, the Lord is King of Kings, and so are we incurring his favor.
There's a lot of ways to pretend like we're doing work in his kingdom without actually doing it.
I've never said it publicly, so this is gonna be the first time. It could be misconstrued. I know I said to Kathy, I said to Natalie, you let people privately, we don't really about Roe versus Wade and abortion policy. And the thoughts of Ecclesiastes chapter 6 what you read. It's not, it doesn't make the vileness or
Next week, we're going to try to get to chapter 15, if you guys will read that through a couple times and kind of give ponder to some of those verses. I know that Lee said he's going to be